Latin America. Good afternoon in Europe. My name is José Antonio Ardavín. I'm the head of the Latin America and the Caribbean division of the OECD Global Relations Secretariat. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to the first preparatory webinar towards the fourth LAC Ministerial Summit on Productivity of 2022, leveling the playing field for sustainable integration to the world economy of agriculture and industry. Les recordamos que este evento cuenta con traducción simultánea inglés, español y portugués. Encontrarán los canales en la parte inferior de su pantalla. Aprovechando esta facilidad, me permito continuar en español. El evento de hoy es parte de los esfuerzos conjuntos del Gobierno de Brasil, copresidente del Programa Regional para América Latina y el Caribe de la OCDE, y el propio programa por promover discusiones sobre las estrategias y acciones que los gobiernos de la región pueden implementar para tener una integración al comercio global que sea a la vez productiva, centrada en las personas y sustentable. Este primer webinar será seguido de uno segundo en mayo y tienen por objeto crear momentum hacia la cuarta cumbre ministerial del Programa Regional para América Latina y el Caribe, que tendrá lugar en Brasilia el 23 y 24 de junio de 2022. En estos momentos en que América Latina y el Caribe busca salir de la peor crisis sanitaria, económica y social de las últimas décadas, la región debe reanudar los esfuerzos para impulsar la productividad, una prioridad de largo tiempo para la región, teniendo más en cuenta la inclusión, la sustentabilidad y un contexto internacional completamente diferente. En comparación con los países de la OCDE, la productividad ha sido durante mucho tiempo baja en los países de América Latina. Esto es reflejo de muchos factores, entre ellos el valor añadido de sus productos y servicios se ve reflejado en baja productividad y tiene que ver con la fuerte dependencia excesiva de sus sectores de recursos naturales y a la escasez de mano de obra altamente calificada. Si bien los productores de materias primas de la región están viendo un cierto alivio en el contexto actual de altos precios de los productos básicos, la región no debe nuevamente caer en la complacencia de los altos precios y evitar la transformación estructural necesaria para diversificar su estructura productiva y aumentar su limitada participación en las cadenas globales de valor, en un momento de importante reconfiguración de los patrones comerciales. Al mismo tiempo, mientras la región abre sus economías y se integra en la economía mundial, es primordial asegurar un piso parejo en el comercio, tanto agrícola como industrial. Y este es el tema de la conversación de hoy. Para iniciar este webinar, es un gusto darle la bienvenida al embajador Sarkis, secretario de Comercio Exterior y Asuntos Económicos de Brasil, que ha tenido el gusto de acompañarnos el día de hoy. Bienvenido, embajador Sarkis, tiene la palabra.
Thank you, José. Buenos días. Good afternoon to those who are in Paris. I will speak in English. It is with great satisfaction that I take part at this webinar, co-sponsored by the OECD and Brazil's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I'm happy that we could gather so distinguished speakers and experts from the OECD, other international organizations, and think tanks in the areas of trade, agriculture, industry, science and technology, and innovation. The key topic of this webinar reflects a major international challenge: leveling the playing field for sustainable integration to the world economy. In today's webinar of agriculture and industry. This had been a major challenge over decades since World War II and has become even more so since the pandemic. Moreover, the relevance of the topic has only augmented as we observe the conflict in Ukraine, the effects of the war, and also of economic sanctions and other measures. These are all increasing threats to a rules-based international order. More than ever, we need stable level playing fields to enhance, not to weaken, the multilateral trading system, especially if our common aim is to achieve economic recovery, energy transitions, food security, and sustainable development. The work of the OECD is crucial at this moment, as a platform for evidence-based analysis to foster knowledge, dialogue, and cooperation. This is one of the strongest motivations for Brazil's decision to seek accession to the OECD. I think the time has come to intensify our collective work on understanding the role of subsidies and their possible distorting and adverse effects on efficiency, distribution, and gains from trade for all. This is the basis to improve disciplines, level playing fields, and render them more effectively. I would say addressing subsidies is an unavoidable step, given the overall high rates of public sector debt to GDP and the mounting needs we all face to implement the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, from eradicating poverty and hunger to investing in sustainable infrastructures and mitigate and adapt to climate change. I congratulate the OECD and also the WTO, the World Bank, and the IMF for the study launched last week on subsidies, trade, and international cooperation. This webinar is another contribution to this agenda to help countries reduce and rationalize domestic support while they promote the elimination of trade barriers. Brazil has been and will remain ambitious in every front of the subsidies negotiations at the WTO and elsewhere, industrial, agricultural, and fisheries. Progress in all fronts must be a priority. Certainly, no reform would be acceptable without agriculture. As we all know, Article 20 of the WTO Agreement on Agriculture states as a long-term objective of members the reduction in domestic support and protection. However, so far, we have not managed to establish a level playing field on agricultural trade consistent with the objective put forward at the Uruguay round. Worse yet, levels of subsidy are rising despite the existing provisions. There are different accounts due to different methodologies on the state of global subsidization. However, they all paint a bleak scenario. The OECD APM 2021 report estimated current global agriculture subsidization to be around $720 billion. Cairns Group members estimate that if there is no reform, WTO members will have rights to offer trade distorting subsidies amounting to $2 trillion by 2030. As many studies have shown, apart from distorting trade, these subsidies and barriers to agricultural trade can affect stability of markets and productions, as well as harm food security, currently a top priority in the international agenda. A UN report states that 87% of agricultural subsidies are price distortion. Such price distortions can be socially and environmentally harmful. The link between open free trade on agriculture and the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda shall be stressed. For the benefit of present and future generations of farmers, particularly in the developing world, there shall be improvements toward a level playing field. Having in mind agriculture is part of the solution to different SDGs. It is with great concern we witness little progress regarding agricultural subsidies in Bali or the ensuing WTO ministerial conferences. Brazil and other Latin American countries expect and are working towards a meaningful development on the subject at the ministerial conference at the WTO in June. In the context of the multiple crises we are experiencing, free trade is ever more important. I understand there are different perspectives on short-term efforts, but in the long run, only the reform and strengthening of the multilateral trading system can deliver robust and sustained answers to present challenges and imbalances in global trade. In various industrial sectors, security of supply had risen as a major concern even before the pandemic. Since then, this concern has escalated, and even more so in the international scenario brought about by the conflict in Ukraine. Economic nationalism and protectionism, as well as the spread of competitive industrial policies, may cause deleterious effects over already pressured global value chains. Diversification of supply is a legitimate risk management consideration for consumers and producers. However, a balanced approach should be advocated. Claims of reshoring, nearshoring, and newshoring are to be considered in a cautious manner and consistent with the promotion of a rules-based multilateral trading system. Anyhow, comparative advantage and less distorting conditions should prevail. Countries like Brazil and other in Latin America, which have shown resilience in their commitment to increasingly open and free trade, can be part of the solution in any redesign of the global supply chains, consistent with the need to diversify and lower risks internationally. New industrial policy measures, notably in advanced economies or economies that are less constrained in credit and finance, if not well calibrated, could start a race to the bottom in key sectors and lead to rounds of protectionist policies and subsidies and to more constraints to fair and free trade, compromising the level playing field. Excess emphasis on industrial policy measures may lead to future fiscal constraint and possible overproduction in some sectors. Brazil has been committed to horizontally improving the productivity and competitiveness of the country's economy through macroeconomic and regulatory reforms, as well as infrastructure upgrading, namely through partnerships with the private sector. Our goal is to enhance market-compatible and non-distorting incentives to economic activity. Accordingly, we believe that level the playing field in industry worldwide is key for achieving a sustainable global recovery and a more inclusive development for all, developing and advanced economies. To conclude, I would like to refer to the OECD's decision to open accession discussions with Brazil. This represents a historic milestone for the country and the organization. With the beginning of the accession process, Brazil's dialogue with OECD member countries moves to a new and more intense technical and diplomatic stage. Over this process, and as we complete accession, the OECD can count on Brazil as a country systematically committed to preserve and promote a rules-based order in multilateral trade and beyond. May I take this opportunity to convey my very best wishes for an effective, successful, and productive webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And with that, we conclude this first part of opening remarks, and I give the floor to Lee and Jackson from the OECD that will continue with the next panel and introduce our speakers.
Great, thank you so much, Jose Antonio, and it's really a pleasure to be here to be part of this event. And thank you also for those opening remarks, which are inspiring us and setting us in the right direction. So just to give you a sense of what we have planned for the next a little more than an hour, we will have 3 panelists joining us. We have the Chief Economist from Food and Agriculture Organization, Maximo Terrero, followed by Marian Jansen, who's the Director of the Trade and Agriculture Directorate at the OECD. And finally, Marcos Yank, who's a professor at INSPER, who works in the area of agribusiness and has lots of expertise working in the region. So the show run is that each of these speakers will have 5-ish minutes to make some opening remarks. And then there will be an opportunity for questions and answers from the audience. And please note that we have on our Zoom the question and answer function. So if you have questions, you can go ahead and put those questions in at any moment, and we'll pick them up when we get to the question and answer session. Before we wrap up this panel, there'll also be an opportunity for each of the speakers to make some quick concluding remarks, 2 minutes. I know that Maximo may have to jump off early, so I'll give him an opportunity around 4, and then Marian and Marcos will have the chance right at the end before we close to make some quick closing remarks before we move on to the second panel. So I hope that that's clear. I would, at that point, like to pass the floor over to Maximo Torero for 5 or 7 minutes of opening remarks. Maximo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Distinguished ministers, ambassadors, permanent representative, panel seats, OECD colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your kind invitation to speak today at this webinar. Ahead of the 4th Ministerial Summit on Productivity in June, one of FAO's 4 guiding principles is indeed better production, but together with better nutrition, better environment, and better life. We believe the 4 betters capture the whole concept of the agri-food systems. After all, we need to produce more and more sustainably for growing populations and achieve zero hunger by 2030. But also our target is to reduce inequality and to reduce poverty. So SDG 2, 1, and 10. But taking into consideration all the other SDGs that affects the agri-food system. So I'm very pleased to see that the first session is dedicated to agricultural support and sustainability. Today, policymakers find themselves faced with a number of tremendous challenges that are affecting agri-food systems nationally and globally. Besides the effects of climate change and COVID-19 pandemic, agricultural markets are now increasingly disrupted due to the war in Ukraine, leading to price spikes in food, energy, and fertilizers, hurting families and farmers all over the world. All this, of course, ends to be reflected in food prices. An FAO food price index last month averaged 159.3 points. This is up 12.6% from the February and making its highest level since 1990, and both in nominal and real terms. But our major concern, of course, is that the lack of access to fertilizers, which Russian Federation is one of the key exporters in the world of N, is the first exporter in the world, second of P, and third of K, will be that we could have a problem in the next year harvest, and that could put the situation even into a more critical moment. So we must do all we can to avert a global food crisis at this point, but we need to do this without losing sight of longer-term objectives to transform the agri-food systems and to make them more sustainable, healthier, and equitable. Agricultural policy plays a key role in enabling this transition. Indeed, this has been the subject of the landmark FAO report published in September 2021 titled A Multi-Billion-Dollar Opportunity, where FAO joined UNDP and UNEP to bring expertise on this global issue and call for action on the status quo. If today we are trying to level the playing field for agricultural support to drive sustainability, then we have a few red cards to deal with. The first red card is for the way current agricultural support policies are fixed. They are steering us away from achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the goals of the Paris Agreement. Right now, global support to agricultural producers, and by that I mean price incentives, output subsidies, input subsidies, and subsidies based on production, account to almost $540 billion a year, or 15% of the total agricultural production value. If we carry on as business as usual, then this figure balloons to $1.8 trillion. Over 2/3 of this support is largely price distorting for markets, and that's inefficient, but also harmful to the environment and human health and unequally distributed. We must phase out the most distorting, environmentally and socially harmful producer support, such as price incentives and fiscal subsidies tied to the production of specific commodities. Fiscal subsidies need to be decoupled. More investments are needed on public goods and services such as research and development and infrastructure. And that's when we are looking at the whole agri-food system in its whole integrity, because we'll need to look at all the different trade-offs. Also, various unhealthy and emissions-heavy commodities such as beef, milk, and rice receive the most support. And here we need to be efficient. We are not saying we should not keep producing beef and milk products, but we need to find ways in which we can provide the proper incentives to reduce methane emissions while being produced. On the other hand, there are relative disincentives for healthier and more nutritious foods, such as fruits and vegetables. But the report made the case and gave a green card to repurposing agricultural support. To do this, there will be some trade-offs and mitigating measures for short-term impacts that need to be fully part of the plan. Any action we do will have a consequence, and we need to understand that consequence, measure those trade-offs, and trying to minimize them while achieving the objective function that we want to achieve. But governments should redirect, not eliminate, their agricultural support for healthy, more sustainable, equitable, and efficient agri-food systems. Again, we need to keep increasing the budget in agriculture, especially for public goods, and that's why we refer to redirection. It is great to see some countries have begun to repurpose and reform their agricultural support. Brazil, for example, has since 2009 drastically shifted support away from price incentives towards the coupled subsidies and increased public investment. But the action can be broader, bolder, and faster throughout the region. How, then, do we actually implement this? In line of the UN Food System Summit, the report empowers policymakers on the repurposing journey, which needs to be country-specific, as agricultural policy is very different in Colombia than in, say, Argentina, or in any other country. However, in a nutshell, it recommends these 6 steps as guidance. First, to estimate the support already provided. Second, to identify and estimate the impact of the support provided. Third, to design the approach for the repurposing agricultural producer support. Fourth, to estimate the future impact of the repurposing strategy and to identify clearly the trade-offs. And fifth, to review and refine the strategy before implementation, trying to minimize those trade-offs. And finally, to monitor the outcomes. FAO is a technical and policy support partner to help the members to do that. As you know, the LAC region is close to my heart, so FAO stands with you and ready to assist. As we get closer to the Ministerial Summit on Productivity towards a productive, human-centered, and sustainable integrating in the world economy, it is important that we seize this momentum for repurposing and reforming agricultural policies to make sure agriculture in Latin America and the Caribbean became more sustainable and helps to deliver better nutrition, more and better employment, reduce poverty, and a food-secure future for the region that takes into consideration a better environment, better nutrition, and a better life. So it's central for us to work together in this transformation of the agri-food systems and to align a proper incentive so we can achieve the goal that we're looking for, which is achieving the SDGs, and specifically in this case, SDG 2, 1, and 10. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maximo, for setting the stage and reminding us of the real importance of this repurposing debate, and also sharing the concrete steps that FAO has put together for countries who are thinking about how to move along this path towards a new way of supporting agriculture. I next would like to pass the floor over to my director, Marian Jansen. Marian, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you for inviting me to this webinar towards the 4th LAC Ministerial Summit on productivity. Productivity, an important theme also for the Agricultural Ministerial that we are going to organize at OECD early November. So maybe something to keep in mind at the LAC Ministerial, the cross linkages to our Agricultural Ministerial, and then, of course, very important, the topic of this particular webinar, leveling the playing field. And it was already said before that this is an area that is very close to the heart of the OECD, and in particular of the directorate I lead, the Trade and Agriculture Directorate. We were the lead directorate in the collaboration with the IMF, the World Bank, and the WTO on the joint report on subsidies that was launched last week, and that was mentioned before. I'm speaking to you today at in a particular moment, at a moment where food markets are not doing very well and where supply chains in general are not doing very well, where maybe globalization is at a turning point, is more at risk than ever before. That we were having a challenge in the agricultural sector, we knew before. We have been using at OECD the terminology triple challenge for food systems. And Maxim already mentioned these challenges, the challenge of ensuring livelihoods for farmers, of ensuring food security, but doing all this in an environmentally sustainable way. And we considered better, one of the 4Bs, better productivity, one of the keys to being able to meet a triple challenge. Now, if I had been speaking to you 2 months ago or 3 months ago, I would have been focusing on this challenge of doing better livelihoods and food security with sustainability. I would have been focusing on the sustainability challenge. Today, we are very much focusing on the food security challenge, and Maximo has been making reference to this. So let me put the discussion we're having today in the context of the current situation of food markets. Maximo already referred to the importance of Russia and Ukraine in food markets and to the importance, therefore, of Russia's aggression against the Ukraine for what is currently happening in food markets. Russia and Ukraine only represent 2% of global GDP, but together they produce, for instance, nearly 15% of world's meat. Sorry, not meat, wheat. The war in Ukraine has therefore affected the prices of cereals and in particular wheat prices. Now, one of the things that happens to markets is when you get a shock and if you have uncertainty, markets sometimes overreact, and we may have been seeing something like this. We saw wheat prices shooting up to 160% of where they were before the aggression of Russia against Ukraine. Now they are back to 25% above pre-crisis prices. Now, when you're an analyst, you sit at your desk and you see how the price goes up and then down again, and you make a nice chart about this. When you are a person in a poor country buying cereals, that jump to 160% affects the amount of food you can buy, may affect whether you can feed your family or not on a particular day. These jumps in markets are therefore something we have to be concerned about. And we do consider in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate that we have a role to play in contributing to stability in markets and also to transparency. This is why we are proud of being a partner in the Agricultural Market Information System that is being led, an initiative that is led by the FAO and that monitors what is going on in agricultural markets, notably in wheat markets. And one of the things you will fortunately see there is that currently the outlook for harvests in countries that are important wheat producers is not that bad for the upcoming harvest. And nevertheless, we are in a situation in markets that we consider of concern, that we consider a potential crisis. So what is our role as policymakers? First, we consider it important to contribute to the debate in a way that stabilizes markets and does not contribute to uncertainty or nervousness in markets. Amos has in the past played a very important role in this respect, and we hope that it will continue to play that role. Second, it is important to signal to policymakers that this crisis should not lead to the introduction of bad policies and that it should also not be used to stop reforming bad policies that were already in place in the past. Now, when it comes to introducing bad policies, we of course think of export restrictions. This is something we often see in moments of tightness of markets or in moments where prices increase. Countries start to introduce export restrictions, and those restrictions contribute even more to increasing prices. So they make the crisis even more severe rather than calming it down. We therefore continue to argue in favor of open markets at the OECD and against the introduction of export restrictions. Second, we continue to argue that it is important not to stop reforming bad policies that were in place in the past. And Maxim already made reference to many of them. At the OECD, in the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, we have been collecting information on producer support to agriculture for decades. Our reports on this matter currently cover 54 countries, and 6 of them are in Latin America: Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Argentina, and Mexico. In the report we published last year, we showed that around 720 billion of US dollar go to agriculture in terms of government support every year. And a lot of this, as Maximo said, is support that is distorting global markets, but it is not even good for sustainability or for the income to farmers. So this is money, this is taxpayers' money going to agriculture that does not contribute to any of the triple challenges. It doesn't help food security, it doesn't increase producer incomes, and it is also not good for the environment. It is important, therefore, to continue thinking about reforming the support to agriculture. Currently, only $1 in $6 of support to agriculture go to policies that we know to be win-win-win policies. That's support to innovation, support to biosecurity, and support to infrastructure. It could be relatively easily envisaged that governments, instead of reducing support to agriculture, they change the way they design it and bring more funding into innovation, biosecurity, and infrastructure in order to help the sector to meet the triple challenge. But what is very, very important is to reduce the type of funding that goes into distortive members, into distortive kind of policies. We heard before that Brazil, but also Chile, are actually very strong positive examples in this regard. They have reduced their support to agriculture to very low levels, and therefore are champions when it comes to not distorting agricultural markets. Other Latin American countries have changed their policies for them to become less distortive, but sometimes their policies are still generating a lot of funding that goes into the agricultural sector. More can be done. It will be important in all countries to channel more funding into infrastructure, biodiversity, and research and development. It will be important to continue phasing out market distorting support. And it will be important to do all of this in a way that nevertheless guarantees access to food for poor households and also incomes that are high enough for poor farming households. The challenge ahead is important, and we are having to deal with this challenge within a difficult period. But as the OECD, we stand ready to continue supporting you in this regard. We continue to work with our members and with countries in the Latin American and Caribbean region on estimating producer support. You will receive the latest updates on our data at the end of June. So we will have new information available for you, and that information will show you how support to agricultural markets has evolved over the past months that have been months characterized by important crises. I look forward to this discussion, and I will be happy to answer any questions that may arise.
Thank you so much, Marian, also for reminding us about OECD's role in this monitoring and transparency exercise around support in agriculture that the OECD has been involved in for decades. I would like now to pass the floor directly to Marcos Sienk, who is joining us from INSPER and has 5 or 7 minutes to give his opening remarks, and then we'll move directly into Q&A. By the way, if you've turned on the interpretation for any reason, if you could turn it off before you take the floor, that would help the interpreters. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Leanne, and my colleague from the panel. I will be speaking in Portuguese because I have a message that will go through more easily in Portuguese. Então, deixa eu colocar aqui alguns pontos sobre a situação lá do level playing field e como é que eu vejo nesse momento a situação, né? A gente teve um acúmulo de uma pandemia e uma guerra, né? Duas coisas que ninguém esperava há 4 anos atrás. E as principais consequências disso são desequilíbrios profundos na oferta e demanda, que vem de uma demanda muito firme, principalmente na Ásia e na China, com preços bastante altos, com volumes de comércio que nós nunca tínhamos visto, né? Okay, now it's okay? Hello? Okay, let me move to English. It will be easier, okay? Okay, thank you. Are you listening to me? Is it okay? Okay, so sorry about that. I was trying to move to Portuguese, but it's not so easy. So let me give you a few points about the situation and what's happening here in Brazil. First, we have a lot of problems in terms of imbalance of supply and demand in the world. First, because of the strong demand in Asia, and especially in China, the level of the global stocks are very, very low. The pandemic have been disarranging the supply chains all over the world. And we are seeing also very strong climatic problems everywhere, especially here in South America. So it's a big imbalance of supply and demand. Second, we have problems in terms of the new geopolitics, the new geopolitical situation after 2000, with the crisis of the WTO, the failure of the Doha round, the problems at the appellation board of the WTO, that's not working at all. And right now, after the pandemic and after the war, what we are seeing is that countries are moving back to a situation of looking for more food sovereignty, increasing subsidies, increasing non-tariff barriers, and also taxing exports like we are seeing today in Argentina, export restrictions in Indonesia and other countries. We also have the trade war that's happening very slowly. We should always remember the agreement between US and China during the Trump administration and all the problems that we had because of this agreement, which is really against all the principles of the WTO. And finally, we have a war in Europe that was not planned before, and that was not, and that will have very, very strong impacts in traditional commodities such as wheat, corn, vegetable oils, fertilizers, and other products. So the situation is a situation of very strong instability, and the main impacts of this situation will be first inflation everywhere. So we are seeing inflation here in Brazil very strong, but also in other countries. And it's very complicated, the situation of the Middle East and North Africa, because of the dependency that those countries have on Russia and Ukraine, especially in corn and wheat. So this is one of the consequences of this situation. It's a situation that we have a pandemic followed by a war. It's really something that we never thought before that could happen in the world. Second, we have a very big increase in production costs that were mentioned by Maximo. We are seeing increase in terms of costs of energy, such as oil and gas, fertilizers, agrochemicals, machines, and equipment. So all the production costs are much higher than ever, especially here in South America. And finally, we have the risk of the formation of new coalitions in a world that's moving to deglobalization. And we are seeing some signals that, for example, we could see an agreement between China and Russia. We see at least an alliance between China and Russia that could lead to a situation where we could move to more trade that's not led by free trade conditions, but by geopolitical relations. So this is the main risk of the war, if the war continues, is to see a situation where we have coalitions of countries, for example, coalitions of countries in the Western Hemisphere and coalition of countries in Asia and other parts of the world. So this kind of risk, we should never imagine that this will not happen, because the whole situation today is a situation where we are moving to more nationalism, more food sovereignty and to specific relations between countries of the world. So Latin America, what's now the situation of Latin America? Latin America is a big exporter of traditional commodities. And traditional commodities are today a problem for the world. The last 4 years, accumulating a pandemic and now war, has been showing to us that products like oil, gas, and wheat, and corn, and you see fertilizers, which are very traditional commodities, we are having a problem today. And Latin America is part of the solution. If we look what happened, especially in South America in the last years, in terms of grains, corn and wheat, in terms of oil seeds like soybeans, in terms of meats, beef, chicken, and pork, in terms of sugar and ethanol, cellulose, cotton, coffee, and in some countries, fruits and vegetables, wines, and you see fisheries. We are seeing that Latin America has a very important role in assuring global security in the world. And Latin America is a region that is today more important in terms of the agricultural trade balance than North America. You see, as you know, in the last years, Latin America have been increasing exports a lot in agriculture, especially in traditional commodities, and has been surpassing the trade balance of the US and Canada. So this is, in my opinion, the main role that we have today is to supply traditional commodities to the world, because we are going to see a lack of commodities, especially in North Africa and in the Middle East, and also in some countries in Asia. And for sure that part of these commodities will continue to come from Latin America. The other point that is important to say is that the total productivity factors of agriculture in Latin America, especially in Mercosur countries, have been growing in the last years. In Brazil, for example, if we compare, if we look from 1980 up to 2020, we saw an increase of 2.4% a year in total productivity in this country. And if you look in the last 20 years, the total productivity gains were more than 3% a year. So I don't see a problem of productivity, especially here in Brazil or even in some other Latin American countries, because we are increasing and we are transforming the way that we are producing commodities. Here in Brazil, for example, we are producing 2 crops a year, or 3 crops, or even 3 crops a year in different commodities. And this is exactly because of the possibility of the tropical climate to produce, for example, soy and corn or soy and cotton in the same area without irrigation. We are also seeing an increase of techniques of low carbon agriculture in several countries. And one of the techniques that we are using more and more is the no-till techniques. So this is happening here everywhere. In Brazil, we are also seeing a very important increase in crop livestock integration, which is the possibility to produce more grains in traditional areas of pastures. In Brazil, we have 80 million hectares of agriculture and 160 million hectares of pastures. And right now, the integration between agriculture and livestock and pastures here in Brazil cover around 17 million hectares. And Embrapa estimates that we could go up to 50 million hectares, 50, in areas of pastures that could be converted to agriculture. And if we have this process, we are seeing not only an increase in agricultural production in traditional pasture areas, but also the possibility to increase the productivity of the pastures and the cattle. So this is a fantastic possibility, not only for our country, but also for many other countries in Latin America. We also have large-scale systems, which are very important in terms of reducing fixed costs in agriculture, and we are seeing those systems becoming more and more efficient. We also have a very intensive and very efficient food chain coordination, especially when we look exports, because most of our developing have been growing in the direction of the ports, in the direction of exports, and we are also moving from infrastructure that used to be based on roads and trucks, and now we are moving to trains and railways very, very rapidly, especially here in Brazil. And we don't have much subsidies in the region compared to other regions of the world. So I believe that we have a very important role in terms of feeding the world with traditional commodities, especially because of the usage of technology. And I believe that the world will need those commodities in the situation that we are seeing today, that we are seeing right now. When we look at the situation of the prices in the world, it's very similar to the problems we had in the period between 2008 and 2013. And you remember what happened at that time. We had the Arab Spring, and we have several problems in the world. And we are right now seeing the same situation happening because of the pandemic and the war. I will keep my comments about sustainability for the second round, but I hope that this first round was good to give a global perspective of the situation, and especially the situation for Latin America. I should also remember you that we are not only producers of traditional commodities such as grains and meat and cellulose and cotton, but we are also seeing today a very important development of, for example, fruits and vegetables, very good experiences in Chile, in Peru, in other countries. So I believe that adding value to our commodities is important, but we should never think that adding value is the only solution, because the world needs traditional commodities more than ever at this time.
Thank you so much, Marcos, also for reminding us the importance of the region in terms of global food security and the transformations that are underway in terms of the sector adopting new practices as well, which maybe we can talk a bit more about that if we move towards sustainability. Now I have my eye on the clock, and I know that Maximo needs to leave just around 4, and we have one question in the Q&A. So I'll first take this question, which is about digital technologies and was directed to the OECD, and then I'll come back to Maximo, maybe to follow up with you on a bit more detail about how to go about repurposing before you need to leave us. But first, I'd like to pass this question that's in the question and answer box to Marian Jensen. This comes from, hold on a second. This comes from Manuel Acero. He's from the Blockchain Supply Chain Association in Colombia. And his question is, accelerating the use of blockchain in agriculture and food is key to accelerating the growth of farmers, lifting many people out of poverty through generating value in food chains. What kind of work has the OECD done in this area?
Thanks, Leanne, and thanks for this question. So at the OECD, we're looking very actively into the role of new technologies for agriculture. We're doing this in different strands of our work. We look at blockchains, but not only blockchains, also other digital technologies. I think it would be fair to say that we have focused in our work mostly on looking what the role of digital can be in facilitating trade of agricultural products and of food products. And that the focus has been on digitalization of border processes, but also of digitalization of everything around certification. So how can we assess that a good meets the standards that we expect it to be assessed? can the process for this assessment be digitalized, and can the transmission of any proof, so of a certificate or of a standard, be digitalized? We have been conducting analytical work on this, but we are also very actively looking into this for some of the standards that we are responsible for. Some of you may be familiar with the codes and schemes that we are responsible for at the OECD, notably the codes and schemes for seeds. And then we are looking in the possibility and the role of e-certification for seeds for cross-border trade. We also have a program called the tractor codes. Here we are looking into different type of new technologies. We are notably looking into the role of robotization for tractors and the increases in productivity that this can entail. So a lot of work going on new technologies and along different channels of our work. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for highlighting that work. Now, Maximo, if you allow me, I wanted to revert back to you because you were framing this question of the level playing field a bit around the idea of the need to repurpose existing support so that we get to better outcomes. So, and I know that FAO has been doing quite a bit of concrete work working with countries, especially since the conclusion of the UN Food Systems Summit. So could you give us an idea of what FAO is saying about what we need to do or how we can translate global recommendations around repurposing support into country-specific work? What are the key ingredients for the design of a successful reporting strategy on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So let me start by saying, based on what Marcos and Marion said, we are in a period which is a period where we need to gain efficiencies. I don't see any other way out of the situation where we are. So if we have less fertilizers in the world, we need to find ways to use fertilizers more efficiently. And that implies understanding what the soil needs and what the plant needs, because it's an issue of demand from the plant and supply from the soil. It's not just an issue of improving my soil. I have to put what my plant is going to absorb from that soil. And that requires soil maps, detailed soil maps, to gain efficiencies and reduce waste of fertilizers. The same applies to the repurposing here of subsidies, because the government resources are very restricted. And we need to find ways in which we use this money in the best possible way and align the incentives so that we minimize distortions. If we want to minimize problems on climate and on the nature and on emissions, we need to clearly assess what are the potential trade-offs of the way the distortions or the subsidies are being done today. And that means analytics, means to bring up evidence, and means to bring data, which will allow us to better understand what needs to be changed and what will be the consequences of those changes. And to achieve these sustainable impacts, we have to do research to shift towards greater investment in public goods that will be aligned to a more increasing productivity, of diversification of products so that we can have access to all the food groups that we need to achieve healthy diets, but at the same time minimize the trade-offs over the nature and the environment. Now, translating this message of the repurposing that we are working on in FAO is not only just an issue of governments alone. It requires to work together with all the stakeholders, including farmers, agribusiness, farmer groups, and other organizations and national research institutions. A repurposing strategy needs to be country-specific because each country objective and context differ, but also because the political economy is different, and changes in the policy and investment will inevitably have winners and losers. Therefore, we need robust data and analytics, which are essential to inform such a strategy. And it's important that countries systematically monitor the effects of the policy on prices and track the level of composition of the expenditure going to the sector. So only with a solid understanding of what are the results of the support and how much and how many trade-offs, and quantifying those trade-offs is the only way, at least I see, that we can move forward. And we need to have clarity: what is the role of the government, what is the role of the private sector, and so on and so forth. I am coming from meetings today at the highest level where they are arguing that we need to pick fertilizers and give fertilizers to one region. That is not possible. That is the same as assigning reserves from one country to the other. Every country has its own rights on their stocks. we have to find ways in which we make markets more efficient. And I think that's the goal. And that's why trade is so important today. Of course, the ideal is to move to multilateral trade, but if we cannot, we need to find alternative solutions and work with interregional trade and accelerate that process and especially reduce NTBs. But again, efficiency gains for me is the way to move. And there is a lot of efficiency gains we can do today in terms of repurposing of subsidies. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maximo, also for being with us. I know you may have to drop off. Right, the strong reminder that we need to focus on efficiencies and this data evidence and monitoring to make sure that when we're making changes, we actually can see that the policies are having an impact on the ground. So that's a very good reminder. Marcus, can I turn to you? Let me just double check the Q&A box. I'm going to turn to you, Marcus, now before I pick up that next question, because I'm curious in your role as a professor of agribusiness, and in your opening remarks, you were mentioning some of the transformations that the agricultural sector is going through in your region. Could you give us a sense of what's going on in the area of public and private partnerships in relation to this kind of transformation? Are there interesting examples that you have where the private sector and the public sector are collaborating to find good solutions to challenges that are popping up?
I believe that because of the fiscal situation of the country, we cannot expect investments coming from the government in Brazil anymore. So most of the revolutions that I've been talking, I think that we have two big revolutions for this decade. The first is crop livestock integration. As I told you, we could increase crops in Brazil by 50 million hectares in 10 or 20 years because of these new technologies to use pastures to produce agriculture, and at the same time increasing production of pastures and beef and dairy also at the same time, because we are talking about pastures. But the second big partnership that we are seeing today is on infrastructure, because most of the big investments that we are seeing here in Brazil in terms of railways and also waterways, they are coming with money from the private sector. And because of the right model that we are using today to attract investments and to make all the regulations, I think that we are going to transform Brazil. Brazil is probably the only big country in the world, the only continental country that has been using trucks and roads instead of railways and motorways, because this revolution happened in US, in Canada, in Australia, in Russia, and in other countries long time ago. But here in Brazil, in the last 80 years, we have been abandoning our rail roads to use trucks, and now we are moving back to railroads. We are having big investments in ports, and that's why Brazil was able to increase exports from $100 billion in 2000 to $120 billion in 2021. From 2020 to 2021, we increased 20% our exports, and this is because of infrastructure and also because of the high productivity levels. The area where we don't see much cooperation here in Brazil, Lee, is exactly sustainability, you see, because we are facing very old problems in Brazil in terms of land tenure regularization, especially in the Amazon biome. So the issue of, property rights versus illegal land appropriation. We are also failing our policies to fight illegal deforestation. Deforestation in Brazil was around 3 million hectares per year until 2000. We were able to reduce deforestation from 3 million hectares per year to 500,000 hectares, so 80% reduction from 2004 to 2012. But unfortunately, after 2012, we've been increasing again the deforestation, especially in the Amazon biome, from 500,000 hectares per year to now 1,300,000 hectares. So we've been reducing a lot during 8 years, but we've been increasing again in the last 8 years. And this is because we are not doing the right policies to fight illegal deforestation. 95% of deforestation in Brazil is illegal. Is really done by, you see, criminals or you see situations where there is no real control. And we also needed to implement the forest code, which was approved 10 years ago, but it's not yet implemented in most of the states. So this kind of, you see, public policies are today the most important policies, not only for agriculture in Brazil, but also for the country as a whole, because the image, the reputation of the country is affected by that. And this is not linked to agriculture. Agriculture is a consequence. The problem is the illegality that we are seeing in those areas. So we need to implement the forest code. We need to regularize land tenure and other issues. That's a very long problem. But on the other side, what we are seeing is lots of movements from the companies, from the private sector, in terms of promoting sustainable intensification with very modern production practices, monitoring, doing traceability and certifications. You see, most of the big companies today on grains, on beef, they are implementing very strong programs, at least to control their supply chain. Because if the government is not doing the job the private sector needs to do because of the pressure coming from the clients. So those companies are today implementing very strong programs of, for example, traceability. And if we have traceability, we can have the decommoditization of the products, because we will be able to see and exactly who is doing right and who is doing wrong in terms of controlling the origin of the products, especially in beef, because beef is a very difficult situation compared to soy, for example, because the same cattle can move to many different farms. We are also seeing new economic incentives coming from carbon markets, from payment for environmental services, and from ESG policies from the bigger companies. So this is one of the areas that we are seeing movement in the private sector, but a lack of movement in the government. But if we have more cooperation between the private and the public sector, we can, I believe that we can fight this problem very strongly, as we did in the first years of the from 2004 to 2012.
Thank you. That was great. And it sparked a whole bunch of questions for me. But just this idea of how quickly the traceability technologies are changing and the incentives for the private sector to be picking that up because they can access new demand segments because consumers are caring with their money more about what they're consuming. So I may come back to you on that because I have some curiosity. And I would also notice that we have almost 100 people in the audience, but I've only had 2 or 3 questions come into the question and answer box. So I encourage the audience, if you have questions you'd like to pose to Marian or Marcus, that you go ahead and do that. And while we're waiting for the audience to take action, Marian, I wanted to circle back to you a bit on this theme of transparency, which has been percolating through the comments that people have made during the day. And I know it was also a subject within that international organization report on subsidies that came out at the end of last week. What I'm wondering is if you have any thoughts about how investments in transparency, certain types of investments in transparency might move us along a bit more, especially in this world when we're talking about leveling the playing field and trying to repurpose government policies and support in agriculture.
Thanks, Leanne. Yes, indeed, the transparency is something we have been always a staunch defender of at the OECD, and in particular in the area of government support. I mentioned in my introduction that we have for decades been working on measuring government support in agriculture, and that measurement plays an important role when it comes to transparency, because it allows us then to see how government support evolves over time. And it allows us to see how it evolves in different countries. And that then again allows us to assess the level playing field. Because if some countries distort markets more than others, that has an effect on level playing field. Now I mentioned agricultural markets, but we have been doing this for fisheries. We are measuring fisheries support, and you can find on our webpage fisheries support estimates. We have been doing this for fossil fuels, very relevant for sustainability. You can find on our webpage information on government support to fossil fuels. And we have started to work in this area also for subsidies to the industrial sector, and now also to services. Now, one of the things we have been doing is bringing all these things together in different ways. So we have recently created a webpage where you can find an entry point into all our subsidy portals for agriculture, for fisheries, for fossil fuels, and for the industrial sector, everything on one page. The other thing we've been doing is bringing together what we do with what other international organizations do. And you just mentioned the report that we published with W2 IMF and the World Bank. In this report, we bring together the different types of work we are doing, the different work we have been doing on subsidies, on government support, and try to bring this together in a way that helps readers to better understand how government support has been evolving and how this potentially the type of support that distorts markets could be addressed. Now, we all look at government support, but if you look at government support from the IMF point of view, you look at it from a point of view of a budgetary impact on the budget of the national government, whereas we look at it from a point of view of potentially distorting markets. So we have been not only investing in developing concepts for measuring government support, in collecting data to measure, assess these concepts, to do this in a continuous way over time, to do this across sectors. And we now increasingly work with others in order to make sure that we bring all the knowledge together in a transparent way, all because we believe that transparency is very important to make markets function efficiently. Lian, you are an economist, I'm an economist. Several people here in this panel on the audience are economists. We believe that markets function, but we have sometimes forget that the underlying assumption is that there's information available to everybody. And by bringing transparency on government support, we contribute to availability of information on markets. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Marcos, I don't know if you have any thoughts linking to what Marian just was talking about in terms of transparency, or maybe what kind of information is particularly useful from the private sector perspective. I could start with that question. I have another question also in my pocket.
I believe that that transparency will be a very important point because of the ESG policies of the companies. So what we are seeing today is that those companies are really changing very much in terms of giving full visibility on what they are doing in terms of social, environmental, and economic issues that are related to them. The problem is that the sector is very heterogeneous. So companies that are exposed to international clients, to banks, and to international reputation, they are doing this job very quickly, and they are trying to do not only their job but also doing the job that the government is not doing in terms, for example, of controlling supply chains and controlling illegal deforestation through different mechanisms. But you see, the problem is that some other companies that are selling to internal markets, for example, and that are not exposed to credits and international financiers, they are not moving in the same speed. So we are seeing different speeds. You see different speeds happening at the sector. So I believe that the main way to move this issue of sustainability would be having the governments doing the job. You see, 65% of the deforestation, 95% of the deforestation is illegal. Yes, you see, it's irregular or illegal because those things are happening. In one side, there is illegality, full illegality. On the other side, the government is not fast enough, for example, to implement the first code and to give the authorizations and the licenses. It takes many, many years in some regions. So the government needs to be much more transparent and much more efficient because, for example, 60% of the deforestation is happening in public areas. It's happening in indigenous areas. It's happening in you see parks that are where we could not have deforestation. It's also land settlements that were implemented 30, 40 years ago when we have the colonization programs in the Amazon, because we needed to remember that 30 years ago or 40 years ago, the government has been promoting and moving people to the Amazon and gave a lot of, conditions and credits to explore the Amazon. And today we needed to do exactly the opposite, to reduce deforestation. But there is still deforestation happening in areas of colonization in the past. And also we have 50 million areas that have no owners. You see, the area that can be just invaded, but should be controlled by the government. So in my opinion, the problem here in Brazil is first, if the second tier and third tier of the companies will follow the first tier in terms of, monitoring, traceability and things like that. And the second one, if the government will be more transparent and more effective in the implementation of the policies. We needed to remember that here in Brazil, agriculture can have 3 different roles when we talk about climate change. Agriculture can be the villain if agriculture is linked to illegal deforestation. Agriculture is also a victim of the climate change, especially here in tropical areas where we are seeing problems of dry season and also frosts and things like that. But agriculture can also be the solution if we implement the right policies and the right techniques such as crop livestock integration and also no-till and 2 crops a year, etc. So we can have these 3 roles in agriculture. And this depends very much on public policies and depends very much if the companies that are doing the right job will be followed by the others.
Thank you very much. Also reminding us that agriculture could be part of the solution if we can all find the way to work in the right direction. I just realized that Ambassador Sarkis has had his hand up, so I would like to pass the floor over to you, Ambassador. Sorry for the delay.
No problems. Thank you, Lee. It's a fascinating debate. We have on one side, for instance, Marion recalling that the OECD has done important work, continues to do important work on data collection, on transparency, and in showing that markets, they generate important signals, important incentives, and we have to rely more on the workings of markets, price determination, and so on and so forth. And I do agree with her. I also saw Maximo making the case for further studies on how to better invest resources in public goods. And I see Marcos pointing out to challenges of public policy in Brazil. And in other countries to render agriculture even more sustainable and so on and so forth. When we take all of that and project into our debate about leveling the playing field, we have to try to identify possible international solutions. And the way we have been studying that indicates that we don't have alternatives to a multilateral understanding, to multilateral effective disciplines on subsidies, so to combat distorting subsidies. And I think, as I tried to say at the beginning, I think this is a tremendous opportunity. We are very much collectively facing budget fiscal tightening. high levels of debt, and in need of addressing SDGs, from poverty and hunger to sustainability, climate, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't it be the right moment for the OECD, for instance, to advocate orienting resources to distorting subsidies to, say, MDBs? Janet Yellen just made an important speech, I think 2 weeks ago, saying, well, we have to strengthen the role of the multilateral institutions, including the development banks, so they can stimulate markets, private funds, to further invest in sustainability, in water, sanitation, sustainable infrastructures in rural areas related to connectivity, and so on and so forth. So can we do more in informing and in giving advice for public policies in the international sphere, not specifically in countries or specific markets? So this is a question I pose to the panel, maybe to Marion, how we can integrate the trade perspective, Marion, of distortions and so on and so forth, the relevance of information with financial policies, public goods, and so on and so forth on the international basis.
Thank you so much, Ambassador. I think the ambassador posed a question to you, Marion, so I'll bounce it to you, but I see that Marcos also would like to react. So this is a nice way maybe for us to move into wrapping up the session, if you want to build in your wrap-up comments into your response.
You want to take Marcus first, and then I give me time to think about the ambassador's question, or should I go immediately? And I'm happy to go immediately. Now, I've been very upbeat about what I do consider fantastic work on measuring and assessing government support to different sectors. And I think it's quite unique that we have been doing this across sectors. And I think we have been able to do this quite unique type of work because we are able to bring financial expertise and real economic expertise together at OECD. I've been mentioning agriculture, fisheries, fossil fuels, industry. I did not mention export credits. Export credit is an area where we are actually a standard setter, the rule setter of what should and should not be done in the area of export credits. And this is a prime example of work where we are actually directly working with financial institutions, both from the private and the public sector, in an area that is relevant for the real economy, for trade. And this is, I think, a very specific expertise that the OECD has been able to bring to the discussion. Now, that was the upbeat story. Now, what has not worked well? And sometimes in interventions, I've been saying, we have been preaching for 3 or 4 decades that support to agriculture has to be reduced or at least redesigned. We have seen change. We have seen progress in the 2000s. Progress has been slowing down in this repurposing or in this redesign. But the overall support to the sector has not been reduced drastically. So yes, we have to become better in our measurement driving policy reform. Now, first, some of this reform doesn't necessarily happen, at least at the international level, at the OECD. A lot of the agreements on what to do, how to reform, how to bind your hands happens elsewhere, for instance, at the World Trade Organization. And a lot of our work feeds into the discussions at the WTO. You mentioned the ministerial meeting in June, and we very much hope that the work we have been doing contributes positively to the debates at MC12 and afterwards. It's also sometimes in other places, not the trade-related places, that rules are being set that are relevant for trade. For instance, in our competition committee at the OECD, a very important recommendation on competitive neutrality was agreed upon last year. And that recommendation is actually not only relevant for the level playing field at the national level, but also potentially for leveling the playing field at the international level. So that's an area where we are working in the trade community together with the competition policy community in order to understand how to best implement change. We are definitely trying new ways to drive the agenda, the collaboration with the other agencies that you mentioned yourself, Ambassador, is one of these attempts. We show that we are united, that we work with each other, try to create synergies, try to optimize taxpayers' money in a way that delivers outcome for what the governments invest in these international organizations. We hope that also our ministerial meeting for agriculture at the beginning of November will contribute to very concrete ideas on how to repurpose or redesign, how to change the way governments support agriculture. And we will definitely continue to make the case, as we have been doing, for more support to research and development, for biodiversity, and for infrastructure, because we consider these three areas very important for a win-win agenda, good for productivity, good for incomes and food security, and also good for sustainability.
Thank you very much, Mariam. Also, that link to the triple challenge is a nice ending for the remarks. Marcos, over to you, I guess, to respond maybe to the ambassador, but also for any closing thoughts you'd like to pass on.
Okay, I believe that one of the problems of the process of deglobalization that we are seeing after 2000, and I believe very much that we had the best of globalization in the 90s, after 50 years of growth, and you see international multilateral organizations in the world working well. But after 2000, we start to see problems everywhere in terms of countries trying to find solutions themselves for the problems without coordinating with other countries. We are seeing problems in this area, not only at the WTO, where we had the failure of the Doha round, and we also have the appellation body that's not working today, but we are also seeing problems at the climate negotiations. For sure that we had movements, good movements in Glasgow last year, but we need much more than that. Right now, for example, there's a lack of fossil fuels in the world. So we are seeing that the transition from fossil fuels that represent more than 80% of the energy to renewable energies is still very, very slow. We are also seeing problems at the World Health Organization that was not able to coordinate countries in the pandemic. We are seeing a very difficult situation at the United Nations in terms of global security and how to treat the issue of the Russia-Ukraine war. So I would hope that OECD will do the job in terms of trying to coordinate countries in terms of reducing subsidies, because subsidies today is not anymore just an issue from rich countries as it was in the past. Because in the past, when we talked about subsidies, it was always US and Europe leading the subsidies in agriculture. But today we are seeing an increasing number of subsidies in emerging economies, export restrictions that are very complicated today because right now we need commodities, and also the problem of non-tariff barriers that are increasing in several areas, and especially sanitary and technical barriers. So I believe that we need much more global coordination at this time than ever. And the issue and the reason for that is that it's absolutely impossible to assure food security, food safety, affordability, nutrition, and sustainability without having open markets. Countries will never solve these 5 issues if they are closed to the world. Because, for example, Latin America is a region that will be a net commodity, a net food exporter, because of the natural conditions of, you see, soil, water, climate, and also technology and also people. And Asia is a net food importer because of China today, Southeast Asia, which is growing their imports, but in the future also India, Africa, other regions. You see, the main problem of the world in this century is how to feed Africa and India, because they will have a very important increase of population during the next years. And the agricultural model that they are using today is not enough to solve the problem on traditional commodities. So we need trade, we need market access. And unfortunately, the WTO is not solving this problem. And the OECD is mapping the situation very well for a long time. You have the best system to measure and to quantify subsidies, and you see it, and all kinds of trade barriers, but there is not a coordination, a real coordination between countries to reduce the problem of subsidies in terms of looking for food security, food safety, sustainability, affordability at the same time. And this is a real challenge for the world, especially after the pandemic and the war.
Thank you very much for those remarks. And I think it's to me to just do a little bit of a wrap up before we pass over to the next seminar. So we've covered so much ground in the past hour, focusing on this level playing field and the question of how to repurpose the support that governments have been providing to agriculture for years. We had some really interesting insights about the private sector and the kinds of incentives that create change at the private sector level that maybe are distinct from public incentives. But then we came back to think about more clearly how policies can actually affect change. And that's really, I think, what we were starting the conversation on. And that led us to talk about data and monitoring, the importance of keeping track of what's happening on the ground, the importance of transparency, and the investments it takes in transparency in order to be able to have information that is digestible and usable by stakeholders, policymakers, private sector, consumers throughout food systems. And then I just would like to echo and amplify this message about the importance of coordination. We know the world right now looks fairly chaotic. A lot of these big problems, like Marcos and Marian had said, food security, sustainability, global nutrition, livelihoods, they're not going to be solvable but one country at a time. I think the message that came from this panel was that greater coordination, greater efforts to make sure that trade is working smoothly and open markets is something we all should be paying attention to. So with that, I will thank Marcos and Marian and Maximo, who's not with us. And I know the audience is also thanking you quietly. And I'll pass the floor back over to the moderator, the head moderator. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Leanne. And thank you for the panelists of this very interesting first part of the webinar. I really think it was a very, very interesting discussion. And now we continue with our agenda. And for this matter, I introduce Julia Nilsson, Deputy Director of the OECD Trade and Agriculture Directorate. This second panel is entitled Old and New Industry Support, Global Trends and Impact for LAC. And it has the objective of providing a global overview of government support for industry and recent trends, both in terms of intensity of support and the forms that it takes for the main players in international markets. So let me invite also the panelists of this second panel, Jehan Sauvage, Trade Policy Analyst of the OECD Trade and Agricultural Directorate, Guy Lalande, Senior Economist from the Directorate of Science, Technology and Innovation, also from the OECD, and Kamala Dawar, Reader in Commercial Law, University of Sussex. So dear Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jose Antonio, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here on this important topic. I was listening to Leanne's summary on the last session. I was thinking there's many points and counterpoints here. She was talking about the role of the public and private sectors, but also how important policies are and how policies can affect change, but also data monitoring and transparency and the investment that it takes and coordination. And these are all issues that we're going to come back to in this panel, because unlike in agriculture, where we know quite a lot about subsidies, and I think that we had a very rich discussion in the last panel, there's a lot we don't know yet about industrial subsidies, about the nature and scale, about what's going on. But there's also a very complicated policy context that we're seeing. This is a growth area. It's been an issue for a long time, but it's become more important. And there's a couple of reasons behind that. Some of it is to deal with the scale of the green and digital transformations required of economies, and where governments are really looking to see how can we meet those challenges, how can we become part of those new sources of growth and jobs. And there's also something of a slightly more defensive agenda, as the last few years have seen various shocks and disruptions to global supply chains, which has made some countries wonder whether they can rely on global markets, and should they be looking for more sources of domestic production and using government support to encourage or facilitate that. So this discussion is taking place against a background where I think it's fair to say that governments are looking to become more activist and more interventionist than they have for a while. And certainly in the wake of COVID-19, we see that there's been quite a lot of state involvement in the economy. And so the question is, how can this be made to work? So one of the things that we see is that there is a long history of various forms of industrial policy and industrial subsidies, and some of it's good and a lot of it has not been so good. So how do we get it right? And what do we know about what are good subsidies in this respect? And I think we've heard a lot from the last panel too, certainly that once you introduce subsidies, you have them for a while. They can be kind of hard to reform. So how do you make sure that you do it the right way to begin with? So as Jose Antonio mentioned, we have a great panel to discuss this today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from them and also to hear from you and your questions. So a reminder, please, to put questions in the chat. A small reminder too to my panelists to switch off the interpretation when taking the floor as well. So maybe we'll start firstly with you, Jean. So you've been looking at trying to unpack and understand what's happening in industrial subsidies. You've looked at some specific sectors, you've looked across sectors. What are the things that you found that you would say for a region that's looking at industrial subsidies? What have you learned?
Oh, hello, Julia. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, many lessons that we've learned. I'll start by saying that anyone telling you we know the exact amount of global subsidies for manufacturing is not telling the truth, because no one knows actually what's the total amount. So I'm not going to give you a big dollar number about X billions are being given in the world right now for manufacturing. What I can tell you is we've been looking at several big firms in manufacturing and trying to understand from the bottom up what subsidies they might be getting, how much, and so on. The big picture we've uncovered is that subsidies can represent about between 2 and 4% for some firms of their revenue. Now, that doesn't sound much, but 2% of revenue can be the difference between a profit and a loss. So it can be pretty significant. Generally speaking, if I simplify a bit, about 1/3 of all support is government grants, 1/3 is income tax concessions, like tax holidays and so on, and another third is cheap loans provided by state banks, for example, with subsidized interest rates, or government loan guarantees, and so on. Now, this is the overall average, but of course, this varies hugely for different sectors. A lot of the support we found was for heavy industries like aluminum smelting, steel making, cement production, chemicals, fertilizers, glass making as well. When you look at those big heavy industries, the one thing that jumps is really cheap loans, below market borrowings, as we call them. That's because these heavy industries are already capital intensive and depend on debt financing very much. So any subsidy via debt is going to be huge. By contrast, when we looked at more higher tech sectors, downstream, like semiconductors, telecoms equipment, aerospace and defense, here it seems to be that tax breaks are a lot more common, partly because these companies spend a lot of R&D and there's a lot of tax breaks that encourage R&D spending. But we've also found a lot of sometimes government equity injections because most of these firms don't finance themselves through the debt channel, but through equity. And this opens up a whole other debate about government ownership and government investments into companies. Because one other thing we found is that if you look at the ownership structure of firms, those firms that tend to get the most support in manufacturing are generally firms in which governments own between 25 and 50% of the shared capital. Even more so that firms that have 50% plus government ownership, which might be surprising. And another thing I want to point out as well is not only do these government invested firms get relatively more support than private competitors, but the way the support is channeled to these firms is actually through another set of government-owned enterprises, so government-owned firms, which can be state banks, state utilities, that to provide cheap energy, cheap loans, or even cheap equity in the case of government investment funds into those companies. So you have a very complex network and value chain of support in a way with governments invest firms channeling support toward other governments invested firms that are producing industrial goods. That's for the big picture. Let me stop here so that I stick to my 5 minutes.
Thanks very much, Jean. That's a very helpful start to this. If I can turn now to Guy, in your area, you've been coming at if Jean is sitting in the trade world, looking at subsidies and looking at what governments are providing across it. You're in science, technology, and innovation, and you're looking at how this all wraps up into industrial policy. And can you tell us, what are you seeing in terms of what governments are doing and the kinds of instruments they're using?
Thanks a lot, Julia. So yes, when you hear industrial policy, you immediately think about these top-down sectoral policies that have been implemented in both developed and emerging economies with, let's say, an uneven degree of success. On the contrary, today, I would like to highlight two messages on industrial policy. First, that industrial policy is not only about these sectoral policies aiming at building a competitive national industry in a given sector. And second, that industrial policy does not only rely on subsidies and public financial support, but is embedded in a much larger set of policy instruments. So first, as I said, industrial policy is not only about old-style sectoral policies. Nowadays, industrial policy has new objectives beyond competitiveness and productivity growth. They remain, of course, of primary importance, but we also see that the development of new objectives, such as the green transition, the resilience of global value chains, the inclusiveness of economic development, the attainment of sustainable development goals, and so on. And with recent changes, such as the COVID-19 pandemic and climate change, these new industrial policies, which existed already in most of the countries, are gaining further traction. For instance, over 80% of the world's economy has adopted carbon neutrality goals by mid-century, including in Latin American countries such as Chile or Costa Rica, for instance. And most of these countries have published or are working on green industrial strategies in order to reach carbon neutrality. And after the COVID-19 pandemic, countries are also adopting massive recovery packages, which are not only an opportunity to build back better, but also an opportunity to implement better industrial policies. My second point is about industrial policy, not relying only on subsidies. And with these new objectives and these more complex challenges they try to address, many countries are moving from industrial policies to industrial strategies. So beyond the words, it means that they are more and more taking a policy package perspective, and they understand that complex challenges need to be addressed by several instruments. Subsidies remain important, of course, and they have an instrumental role in addressing market failures. For instance, the development of technologies that are necessary for reaching carbon neutrality. Let me take a concrete example here. Last year, we worked with the government of the Netherlands to help them implement their green industrial strategy. And we realized that on the one hand, green hydrogen was necessary to fully decarbonize their heavy industry, such as fertilizers or steel production. But on the other hand, carbon pricing and other standard climate policies were calibrated to support close to the market technologies, such as, for instance, wind turbines, but were insufficient to incentivize firms to explore emerging technologies such as green hydrogen, for which subsidies were needed. So if well-designed, subsidies can foster not only the development, but also the dissemination of these technologies and reduce carbon emissions, both domestically and abroad. But even if they remain important, as I mentioned, subsidy needs to be supplemented by other types of complementary policy interventions, such as demand-side instruments and framework conditions. So on demand-side instruments, let me take the example of the automotive industry. If you want to design a coherent strategy to reduce carbon emissions from cars, you probably need to support research on electric powertrains, batteries, and so on. But you also need to create the demand and ensure that customers are going to buy these environment-friendly cars. And this is usually achieved through, for instance, emission standards or subsidies to electric vehicles. And finally, you also need framework conditions, such as charging infrastructure for electric vehicles, sound competition to let disruptive emerging firms gain market share, skills policies, technical standards, and so on. Let me finish on this. Let me come back on the example of green hydrogen to illustrate the importance of technical standards, which I find an illustrative and very interesting example of a win-win industrial policy. So green hydrogen is much cheaper to produce where renewable energy is abundant. I know Chile is very ambitious in this respect, and I know that Costa Rica also recently launched its green hydrogen strategy. And in this case, gains from trade are potentially very important, both from an economic and an environmental point of view. So gains from trade are potentially very important, but the emergence of a regional and international market for green hydrogen importantly hinges on the definition of international standards, such as guarantee of origin on the carbon emissions linked to hydrogen production, or standards on hydrogen purity. So let me wrap up if I want to keep within the 5 minutes. So to wrap up, I would say that sustainable development requires sound industrial policies, which cover a wide range of objectives that include subsidies, which can be justified to address market failures, but also that industrial policy, if well designed, is not necessarily incompatible with a level playing field.
Thank you very much, Guy. I think you've given us a very good sense of the way that design matters in this area, that there are things that you can do if you're looking to target market failures, if you're looking to find ways to have pull factors or push factors to take things from an early stage through to market, whether you're targeting as well both kind of areas where you can actually make a difference, but as well having a broader eye on ensuring competition at the end of it. So this all sounds like quite a challenging package to get right. So with that, can I ask Carmela, what are some of the challenges for policymakers in this area? What are some of the risks?
Thank you very much, Julia. I think I want to talk about how policy making has really changed over the last 15, 20 years to this kind of whole of government approach, which has become sort of almost a sort of a part of government's sort of political slogans. I know Joe Biden is now talking about the whole of government approach, and he's bringing antitrust into that. Now, a lot of these whole of government approaches seem to have this kind of vague concept of national interest behind it. And there doesn't seem to be much kind of transparency or kind of objective sort of criteria behind that, which is a problem when you bring in these heterodox policies after there's been much more kind of adherence to the multilateral trading system. Now, obviously, these heterodox policies are challenging the multilateral trading system, and it's showing that there are weaknesses and gaps in what's going on at the WTO. However, I think what's really important to hang on to in this big debate about deglobalization and you know the weaknesses of multilateralism is that there's a very sound policy reason behind a lot of those rules. So, for example, we want rules to be transparent. We want rules to be objective and based on sound economic evidence. We want them to be proportionate. And we also want these rules to kind of create an environment, an ecosystem where there's good economic governance in our domestic environments. I think the problem is that sometimes it's like throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and a lot of these policies are being thrown away with some of the objectives of multilateralism. And I just want to talk about public procurement in particular, because this is one industrial policy measure that's often can be characterized more as political than economic. And I've done quite a lot of work in Latin America and the Caribbean and around the world on how governments use offsets for industrial policy objectives. And in fact, the global market in public procurement offsets is estimated at 75 US billion per year and rising rapidly. And yet we all, from an economic point of view, it's widely understood that they have clear welfare costs. And it's also widely understood that competitive public procurement markets based on value for money are pro-poor. And this is sustainable development because not only are you getting as much as you possibly can for resource-strapped governments, but also the poor use public services and goods much more than the wealthy. So this is something that I think we don't really think about. And whenever I've done this work in domestic regimes, I've always been told that this is what we want. We want 30% offsets. We want this and that. And I've never been shown one cost-benefit analysis, one impact assessment report that's been undertaken on these. And I've never been talked about the wider system of flanking policies and sequencing. If you want SMEs to get into your public procurement markets, you want them to have the skills to create a competitive and innovative kind of market for public procurements. So I think what I want to finish off saying is that a lot of industrial policy and the success or failure of industrial policy, industrial strategy is based on good economic governance. And that seems to be secondary to this discussion here of how we use these measures, such a wide variety of measures which have such complex spillover effects that we don't actually know much about at the domestic level. Thank you, Julia.
Thanks very much, Pamela. And I'll open the floor now to participants if anybody has questions. I mean, I think we're seeing quite a rich array of different perspectives. So we're looking both at how this plays out in terms of making domestic economic policy, talking about how you look at creating good industrial policy, and we're looking at what happens when that industrial policy takes the form of subsidies that then have international spillovers. If I can pull out one thing that I notice a number of you have raised, which is in different ways the importance of actually transparency, and whether that's, as Jean talked about, in transparency of understanding what's happening. Kamala, I think you were also talking about the transparency of actually understanding what you're doing and how. And also, Guy, if I can ask you to talk about the role of transparency in terms of these successful industrial policy strategies. So same question to all of you, and perhaps I'll reverse the order. How important is transparency, and what would you look to do in terms of policy making in this area? And I'll start with you, Kamala. And I think you're muted, I'm sorry.
The areas that I work on, which is competition issues, obviously transparency is basically the baseline of all of this. In public procurement, if you want SMEs, for example, to win more bids, transparency is also, a baseline requirement. So, and also if you want to make good public policy in these areas, you need transparency of data, which was talked about earlier, in order to make sound economic policy. So for me, it's the baseline condition.
And who needs to do that? Is it governments?
Well, yes. For example, in the EU, we have the open tender system, and we have a lot of access to the tender information, which is really not available in other countries. And because that data is available, we know so much more about how public procurement systems work, incentives, disincentives, moral hazards, spillovers, because academics and policymakers can mine that data. You don't have that anywhere else. And it's a loss to those governments that people aren't able to mine data and actually find out what works. What we want to know is what works and what doesn't work. And you can't do that without data.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. Guy, what's your perspective on this?
Yes, of course, transparency is very important. Let me underline 2 points related to this. First, we lack comparable data to understand the extent to which countries support their industries and in which direction. By which direction I mean, do they support the green transition? Do they implement sectoral policies? Do they support their SMEs and so on? And such data are needed for benchmarking purposes, but also for collaboration purposes. And let me mention that we are currently launching a new OECD project to measure industrial policy expenditures and their objectives across countries. We are starting this year with 10 countries, but of course we welcome new participating countries. And the second point, I think, which is very important, is policy evaluation. Taxpayers need to understand what is the efficiency, or at least the effectiveness of industrial policies, and the policy cycle should feature this feedback loop also between evaluation and implementation and policy design.
Let me just follow up a question on that. So can I ask the countries that you're looking at in terms of looking at the industrial policy expenditures and objectives?
Sure. So let me try to give you the list. I'm not sure I'm going to find the 10, but we have countries such as Canada, Israel, Denmark, Sweden, France, Ireland, the European Union as well, and I think I'm close to the 10. So these are only OECD countries, and you will also notice that in this list currently there is no Latin American country.
So one of the questions I have when we talk about expenditures and objectives, and this is certainly one of the things I think that came out from the last session in relation to agriculture, is that often we see a bit of a mismatch between a stated objective and the nature of the expenditure. So how can we best ensure, I mean, what are you seeing in the work that you're doing on industrial policy in the relationship between the stated objective and how well the expenditures or how well the policy instruments are targeted at that objective?
I really agree with what you just mentioned. Stated objectives can sometimes be misleading. So when I presented the project in one sentence, I used the shortcut. What we want to understand is what countries are targeting. So in fact, we are not looking at objectives. We are looking at inclusion criteria. So under which criteria investments or firms are eligible. So we try to rely as much as possible on objective criteria and data.
Can I turn to you, Jean, for your answer to that question, and also your own reflection on what you see versus stated objectives and the kind of design and impact of some of the measures that you've looked at?
Absolutely. On transparency, the problem with transparency in subsidies is that usually the first source of information you will turn to is government themselves, but asking governments to disclose data on subsidies is a bit like asking turkeys to choose the menu for Christmas. So you're bound to run into a wall, sort of. So that's why we have institutions like the WTO and the notification system to try to overcome this initial blockage. Now, the problem, as most of you know, is that even in the WTO, the track record and notifications is not really good. We have a lot of countries being very late in their notifications, and even existing notifications that are made on time being sometimes patchy and incomplete. I would go even further that it's not just the fault of not being able to enforce notification obligations in the WTO strong enough, but it's also that countries don't even agree what is a subsidy in the first place, which makes any transparency solution very hard, because a lot of the subsidies or support measures we found, for example, are deviations from what would be called a market consistent transaction. So when you have a cheap loan from a state bank, the interest rate might be subsidized and it might deviate from what a market interest rate would look like for that company. But any evaluation of the subsidy depends on your assessment or my assessment on what the market interest rate is. And in the WTO, countries might disagree as to what is a market interest rate in the first place. So because they don't agree as to what is even a subsidy in the first place, how can they agree to improve transparency? So that's a big challenge I see in the way of all this. Now, turning to the question of stated objectives and the actual effects or performance of subsidies, I mean, clearly, I would agree with what UNP said. You cannot just rely on countries' own declarations when it comes to what a subsidy does or does not. I have a couple of examples I'm going to pick on two countries. The first is a big OECD country that has a big farming sector and lots of farming subsidies. And that country, like most of the countries on the planet, exempts diesel used in tractors from fuel taxes. And that measure is actually in the budget of that government, estimated. That's worth X million euros of revenue foregone every year and so on. And for a long time, at least until 5 years ago, now it's changed. When you look at the budget document of that country, it had the stated rationale for that exemption. And that stated rationale was until recently to favor the mechanization of agriculture in that country, which that country you might have guessed is France. And so obviously it's a bit laughable to think that a diesel tax exemption would encourage the mechanization of French agriculture. So this was changed a few years ago. Another example I want to take is since 2014, the Chinese government has set up a lot of government funds to invest in domestic semiconductor firms at central level, provincial level, and municipal level. So different funds acquire shares or inject new equity, fresh equity into domestic champions in China in the semiconductor sector. But when you look at the official declarations on the governments, these equity injections are described as R&D support measures, as a channel for supporting the R&D efforts of these firms, which is an open question, because what you're subsidizing is the cost of capital. So you're trying to make capital cheaper for these firms, which has a very indirect effect, I would say, on R&D. So these are just two examples, picking on two different countries, but that's very widespread, of course. But just to say that obviously stated objectives are one thing, but the actual truth and effects of subsidies are a whole other thing.
That brings out an important point, I think, in terms of, when we're pursuing transparency, it's transparency about what, and there are no such things as simple questions, I think, when we get into subsidies. Before I turn to the question that's come in on the chat, can I ask you a follow-up, Jean? When you were looking at the semiconductor sector in particular, a high-tech sector, which has a large amount of government support, what would you say has been the history or the success rate of R&D subsidies? Have they been an important factor in that sector over the years? What's the evidence on whether they've played a very important role?
It's a very, very complex question. I'll try to stick within a couple of minutes to answer it. Basically, to simplify and oversimplify, the whole semiconductor industry has been the target of government support for decades. Like it's been governments intervening ever since the 60s, essentially, already the late 50s as well, to some extent, through various means. So government support is nothing new, and because it's a very R&D intensive sector, it had a lot of those measures supporting the R&D spending efforts of the firms in that sector. Now, whether or not that has been successful is an open question. I don't think it's settled yet. In terms of historical evidence, there isn't much, to be honest. There's a few papers that try to look at this, but it's very patchy, the literature. What I can tell you is that what's happening today, and for today's companies and today's subsidies, on average, semiconductor firms spend about 10% of their revenue, annual revenue, on R&D. For some firms like AMD, it's 20% or more. Intel, it's anywhere between 15 and 20% every year, maybe a bit less, a bit more. Samsung, it's about 10%. So it's huge amounts. We're looking about billions and billions of dollars that these companies of their own choice are spending on R&D. When we measured R&D subsidies for these firms, whether through tax breaks, federal or state grants, and so on, we arrived at a number that was, in general, less than 1% of their revenue. So the gap between 15, 20% and less than 1% of their revenue is what they're actually spending themselves. And the reason why they're spending so much on themselves is because in semiconductors, if you stop innovating, if you stop investing in R&D, you're dead. If tomorrow Intel stops investing in R&D, the vast sums in spending, Samsung and TSMC would just take over what remains of Intel's business, and vice versa. So it is a question whether subsidizing those incumbents that are very large firms and already spending vast amounts of R&D is really making a huge difference. Now, that argument might be very different when it comes to SMEs and small firms that have trouble accessing capital markets. And maybe Guy has more insight to offer. I don't want to put you on the spot here, but the work we've done basically is about large firms and not SMEs. And SMEs might have different challenges. And so whatever I say about R&D only applies to large firms.
Thanks. And actually, I'm going to turn to Guy and then to Kamala on this in terms of, so what do you see in terms of the track record of success on R&D and what matters in terms of ensuring additionality? How do we make sure that we're not putting public money into something that firms would have done anyway? And Kamala, how do we make sure that we get everybody benefiting from this? How do we also, you were talking earlier about the importance of having firm capacity built at the same time as policies and industrial policies targeting them. So maybe if I can turn to you first, Guy, in terms of what have you learned on the industrial policy front?
Yeah, so in fact, the OECD has worked for a long time on the evaluation of R&D tax support and R&D subsidies. In general, these R&D tax support and R&D subsidies are found to be additional. So it means that for €1 of public support, firms increase on average their R&D expenditures by at least €1. That being said, there is a lot of heterogeneity across countries, across firm size, across many dimensions. And here policy targeting is a very topical question. To come back on what Jean said on firm size, whether this additionality is higher for large or for small firms, I think the jury is still out on this question. And there are a lot of conflicting evidence on this. It seems that maybe for smaller firms, the effect of R&D tax support and R&D subsidies is slightly larger. But then another question arises. It's whether it's due to really this incentive or whether it is due to the relaxation of financial constraints thanks to the inflow of money. And if it is the latter, then maybe R&D subsidies and R&D support are not the most efficient industrial policy instrument. It may be more effective to help these small firms to provide loans or any type of financial instrument, which can relax financial constraints while limiting the amount of public money spent. And to make a last point on this question, heterogeneity is important across firm size, but it's also important across policy design. And here again, the jury is still out. Even for well-defined policies such as R&D tax incentives, there are a lot of details, whether you can carry forward the cost, whether the tax scheme is based on your incremental expenditures or your R&D expenditures. And again, these debates are not settled yet, and the answer may be highly country dependent as well.
Thank you. Kamala, what's your reflections on this?
Well, just thinking about additionality and the role of the OECD here as well, actually, just thinking about export credit financing and export credit agencies. Now, you know, they are traditionally the lender of last resort, and they are supposed to only step in when private sector isn't able. They're not supposed to crowd out the private sector. Now, in my work on that, I've noticed that, you know, for the US, EXIM, for example, they have an additionality checklist. And one of those criteria are competing with other ECAs. So I just wonder from an OECD arrangement perspective, maybe there could be a little bit more kind of like harmonization, I don't know, transparency on what exactly is additionality. Because if it is just competing with another ECA, that's, you know, as that you would say, nonsense on stills. So I guess what I would like to see is kind of more kind of transparent, objective criteria for additionality and export credit support. And actually maybe, I mean, how do you work it out anyway? Because those transactions are so fast that I would like to see the OECD working with the arrangement participants on trying to work that out a little bit more. Thank you.
I think that's an important issue to have raised. Can I turn now to the question that because I think this is not unrelated. So we have a question in the chat that says, how is the deindustrialization process playing a role towards the upcoming Ministerial Summit on Productivity Performance in Latin America? And what is the role of the agribusiness value chain, particularly the services and its primary links? And I guess what I'd like you to kind of reflect on in that, I mean, it seems to me that part of this question is also the problem of you have a thriving primary sector. You'd like to leverage that. You'd like to leverage that to take advantage of the links into services, into manufacturing, to move up the value chain, to build an industrialization process. What is the role of the kinds of policies that you're looking at? What is the role there? Is there a role that we can use with government procurement? Is this a role where industrial policy would play a role? Is this something where there can be a good role for subsidies? Who would like to take that first? Probably it's more in your bailiwick, Guy.
Okay, so I won't really answer the whole question, but we'll focus on one or 2 points. So first, I think there is a growing attention in the policymaking world on the concept of industrial ecosystems. It is a way to acknowledge that, in fact, when you want to promote innovation, productivity growth, or the competitiveness of some of your industries, maybe you don't have to focus only on one sector, but you should take into account the whole value chain. And by value chain, I mean not only the related sectors, but also institutions, including university research centers, all this ecosystem that can participate to increased productivity in the sector. And one example of that is the new European industrial strategy, which relies on this industrial ecosystems concept. And in fact, they have partitioned the economy into 14 ecosystems, and the agri-food ecosystem is one of those.
Jean, Kamala, would you like to comment on this?
Not sure I would have much relevant to add to what he said.
Perhaps I'll make just a comment from the work that we've done on the agriculture side in the OECD, is actually looking at this question about how do you add value in agriculture value chains. And some of this can be related to even in a lot of agricultural products, about 25% of the value added is services and about 30% is industrial. Even just when we're talking about exports of agricultural goods. And in fact, what we see is that services is quite important in terms of the competitiveness of agricultural goods. So it can be not so much even just a question of product transformation, but of maximizing the benefits of the services sectors, especially the transport and logistics sectors of commodities as well. So that's something that we've looked across. In terms of where that takes you with industrialization and deindustrialization, I think what we're seeing as well is moving to, as you saw in the last section, a kind of food systems approach is leading towards a more holistic view of agriculture. Agriculture is increasingly high-tech itself, underscoring the need to have connectivity in rural areas. That really goes to the heart of being able to build that productivity and make those linkages across the sector. Can I ask a different question across to the panel? So a lot of the discussion that we have about subsidies and about industrial policy is one that is about domestic policies. And this is something that happens within a country. So 2 questions for you all. Is there scope for regional cooperation in these kinds of strategies? Is this something that can be done at more than a government level? But also, what are the issues, and perhaps I'll turn to you first, Jean, on this. What are the issues in terms of international spillovers when one country pursues an industrial policy? What are some of the issues that we need to watch out for in terms of the level playing field?
First, I would say maybe from the perspective of a country like Brazil, it's clearly the problem with spillovers is that industrial policy and subsidies can quickly turn into some kind of race to the bottom, and you end up with only the countries with the deepest pockets winning. The problem is that if you don't coordinate efforts, if you don't reach some kind of ceasefire or some understanding of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable, If it's everybody for himself or herself, then you end up with every country trying to be the leader in a given sector and spending way too many resources, public resources, toward that effort. And even from a regional perspective, there can be gains in coordinating efforts so that you don't overshoot, so that you don't compete with your neighbors to engage in some kind of bigger than neighbor policy. We try to steal market share from each other and try to be the front runner at all costs, because let's be honest, only a few countries on the planet can afford to play that game. Very few of them. And even then, they're not assured to win, and they can end up being net losers. There's really a role, whether it's domestic, regional, or of course multilateral, to coordinate that kind of approach to industrial policy and subsidies and define the rules of the road to see what is acceptable, what is not acceptable, what is okay, what is not okay, and who can do what. This is especially important in the world as it is today, given the complexity of the value chains, given the complexity of how manufacturing is done today, where basically subsidizing industry A might end up benefiting industry B in another country, or the upstream suppliers of industry A. And you don't always know that beforehand. These value chains are so complex that the actual incidence of the subsidy might end up abroad, might leak abroad in some way. So all of this to say, absolutely, coordination is essential. And if multilateral cooperation is not possible, at least regional should be undertaken to try to avoid at all costs that kind of race to the bottom.
Thanks, Jean. I'm going to turn to you next, Camila, because I see while my Portuguese is terrible, I'm assuming in the chat that we're also looking here at something that you touched on before in terms of combating corruption and this issue again about the relationship between spillovers, cooperation, and perhaps you can comment also on the corruption aspect.
Well, I think, again, the EU is quite inspirational in its subsidy control regime. There are derogations, there are block exemptions, there are various ways of justifying a subsidy as long as it's proportionate, objective, transparent, notification. But another thing I've noticed is that many, many jurisdictions prefer to see state aid as industrial policy, not competition policy. So I think if you're going to do that, what you need to do is have competition regulators talking about these things, at least to have a competition perspective on these state aid benefits, because it seems to be industrial policy and ministries of industry don't want to talk to competition authorities about them. And that's the same with public procurement. Why wouldn't you want to? These are competition issues. Being competitive is an industrial strategy. Trying to get exports going is industrial strategy. That's about competition. Why wouldn't you talk to the competition authority about that? So I guess that's, and again, I think there are only a few jurisdictions that actually build that into the system.
It's a very interesting point. I worked from a trade perspective recently on a joint paper with colleagues on competition, and Jean has done the same too, looking at this issue of what can we learn from competition policy for government support. Because often the competition policy folks are focused on domestic markets, and now we're looking more at the international dimension. But it's certainly true that I think we have learned a lot from the competition world in terms of the design of subsidies and what they know about creating competitive markets as opposed to national champions. And I think that's an area where there's more to do, especially as I think now competition policy is moving global. It's starting to become more part of that debate, and they certainly, especially looking at the design of emergency support, I think that's where we see that competition policy has been really helpful. So I think it's an important observation, because we have seen that there's a real difference between providing liquidity support to fundamentally viable firms or pouring taxpayers' dollars down essentially insolvent firms, and how long do you keep sort of zombies alive? And having the domestic competition policy lens apply to that actually solves or goes some way to addressing some incipient global and trade policy problems in a level playing field across borders. But maybe, Guy, I can turn to you on this issue about cooperation and whether there's scope for doing this kind of policy at a regional spillover level.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So, of course, when you think about industrial policy, you first think about negative spillovers between countries, and it's true. It's in particular for policies supporting national champions. In most of the cases, they conflict with competition and trade policy rule, have negative international spillovers, and sometimes also negative domestic spillovers, because in the medium run, they can reduce competition and therefore innovation and productivity growth as well. But there are cases where industrial policy can also have positive spillovers. As I mentioned earlier, when you support the development of green technologies in one country, it has the potential to reduce carbon emissions in other countries as well, and this should not be neglected. But of course, there is still the risk that these kind of subsidies result in a subsidy bidding wars and can have a negative outcome in the end. So even if we expect positive spillovers, we need to be careful about the competition between countries on these technologies. And there is space for collaboration, as you mentioned. As I mentioned in my first intervention, a good example of this is the production of green hydrogen. At the world level, some countries have a comparative advantage in producing green hydrogen because they have a lot of, let's say, for instance, solar power. And other countries need this green hydrogen to decarbonize their industry. And the only way to have an international hydrogen market emerging is to coordinate on industrial policies, and in that case, on particular on technical standards.
How well are we doing on coordination on policies across countries? I mean, this is something that's been highlighted by a number of you. How well are we doing? What's the scorecard? What grade would you give international efforts so far? Are we in kind of B+, must try harder, C-, not looking good, D, E, fail grade? Can I turn to you first, Sharon, on that one?
I'll take the easy answer. I would say B. There's been some initiatives taken, to be honest. The problem is that most of them are between like-minded countries. So that limits the scope for a truly global multilateral solution that would really be inclusive of everyone and every country at every level of development. So I would say that, yes, there's been some efforts made. We have to acknowledge that, but it's clearly insufficient, and it's really among, again, like-minded partners.
Pamela?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think it's getting everybody on the same page, and nobody's really talking about China here, but obviously China's the biggest player, and if you can't get China into the OECD group is going to have to go out into the world and meet China there, and that's really very complicated because there's a balance of power that's been carefully built up on one side of the world that's not being perceived in the same way the other side of the world. It's a difficult time.
Guy?
Well, I would say in certain areas, we are probably making progress. And again, here, I think about the green transition. But for the rest, it's difficult to assess this progress if we don't have, again, comparable data on what countries are doing.
So if that's the starting point, you preempted my next question, which would be, what would the thing you would do to kickstart this? So how do we incentivize this kind of international cooperation? And what do you see the role of something like the OECD as doing in terms of kind of kickstarting that kind of cooperation and coordination?
Shall I step in as the non-OECD person?
Absolutely.
I think the OECD is, sounds like you're paying me. I think the OECD is doing really very well, actually, in keeping some kind of consensus discussion going.
Answer.
So a B+. I think it's very difficult. It is not just an international thing; it's a domestic thing. And I think on my wish list there is really the professionalization of the civil service in every country, so that they're well paid, they're capable, and they're independent. And I think that goes a whole lot of way as a positive spillover up onto the coordination and international level. If you don't respect your civil servants domestically, you can't really expect them to make good policy.
Actually, you've also preempted my next question, but one of the things that came out of the work I did with the competition folks was that actually open and competitive international markets are underpinned by open and competitive domestic markets, and vice versa. But can I ask that question then of OECD colleagues? First, Guy, and then Jean.
Yes, so the role of OECD, I would mention two avenues. The first one is, of course, providing data to shed light on what countries are doing. And I think the second avenue is probably to find situations in which collaboration is a win-win for the countries involved.
Jean?
Obviously, I'm terribly biased here, but I would love to see the OECD continue its efforts and taking a more prominent role in measurement. But I just going to put that aside for now and talk about what I think could be a quick fix, and but would go a long way towards helping. Like I mentioned earlier in my interventions, I don't think we can rely on governments to do the job. I mean, the few governments that are really going to be open about the subsidies are governments that don't subsidize much in the first place. So yeah, sorry to name names, but if Sweden or Switzerland become very overt and open about all the subsidies they provide, I mean, that's not going to change the face of the world in terms of subsidies, to be honest. What might be changing things, however, is something that is happening slowly and in the background, which is changes to accounting rules. So for example, whether it's the IFRS standards, the GAAP in the US, there's been changes that are ongoing right now that will compel listed firms to disclose all the government support they get. And so whenever a firm is listed in the US, in Europe, or elsewhere and adopts the internationally recognized accounting standards, those firms are going to have to be a lot more open about all the subsidies they're getting, irrespective of where they're getting those subsidies. And I think this is really one area of progress outside of WTO, outside of all the big organizations that will end up feeding into a lot of data efforts. So more, I guess, on corporate governance, more on accounting standards is maybe a quick fix.
So that does bring me back to the question I was going to ask, which is some of the solutions to this issue. You pointed to ones that lie outside of multilateral rules, that lie outside of subsidies policy. Both Kamala and Guy, you mentioned a lot before that these issues need to be seen holistically, that you need to be able to bring a whole of government perspective, that you need to be able to have joined up policy making. We say that across lots of areas, and it's really hard to do. What do you see as being important in this area? How can countries get more joined up policy in these when they're considering industrial policy? To you first, Kamala.
Well, I suppose it depends on which area you're talking about. But with, for example, competition law, MOUs with different regulatory bodies and with trade ministries on these issues to do with subsidies would go a long way to just getting the perspective from and the institution experience from the competition authority into that. MOUs between the procurement people and the competition people on bid rigging and efficiencies and innovation and competition. You know, I just sort of think there are so many things that that governments can do quite easily through picking up the phone, that somehow they prefer to work in silos. And if you're going to have this whole of government approach, you need to have the telephone, you know, the telephone numbers.
I find one of the things, and maybe Guy, you can comment on this, and perhaps Jean too, one of the things in doing sort of cross different government work that I always find challenging is finding the same way to talk to each other. That there's a sort of common interest, and often you start and you're talking to each other, and at first everybody's excited and this is really good, and then it slowly dawns on you using the same words and you don't mean the same things by them, and then perhaps you realize you're starting to talk across purposes. Then everybody gets a bit depressed, and then slowly you start to find that common language and build up, and often that can take some time to find that you're grabbing the same part of the elephant, if I can use that image. Is that something that you see in the work that you've done, Guy?
Yes, of course. Different ministries and different departments may speak different languages or may have different incentives, and that's a very important point. Let me also mention that I talked about industrial strategies, but what is behind is really the fact that we find complementarities between policy instruments and between policy instruments that may be managed by different ministries or departments. Let me take a very simple example. The complementarity between R&D subsidies and skill policies. Of course, if you subsidize R&D in the short run, if you don't have an increase in the number of researchers, you won't have an increase in the volume of R&D. You will mainly increase the wages of your researchers. So to increase the effectiveness of policies, you need to have this cross-department or cross-ministry approach, and that's very important. And the complementarity between the skill policy and R&D subsidy is just an example. We also know that, for instance, we have strong complementarities between competition and innovation policy, because once we have innovative firms, we need to let them grow, and we need to transform firm-level successes into macroeconomic impacts. Another type of complementarity is between, for instance, bankruptcy procedures and innovation policies, and so on and so on. I can list many different complementarities which necessitates the coordination between departments or ministries.
I think that's very well put. Jean, where's the role of trade policy in that?
I would say first and foremost is to help make the case to other parts of government for why this truly matters. It's a question of subsidies, because too often the debate on industrial policy and how effective or not it gets lost into a domestic discussion. Like a lot of the papers right now in the literature on subsidies and their effects are from a domestic standpoint. Like, did it help country X in its process of industrialization, without ever considering what happens to neighbors, without ever considering what happens to others. And so the first thing trade policymakers can do is to embed that whole discussion into a true cross-border setting, saying what you do domestically does not only matter for you and your industry, but will matter to others and will have effect beyond your borders, which is surprisingly often not considered, like I said, even in economics, in plain economics literature. So that's a bit surprising. Another related point is, I'm not going to add to what Guy and Kamala said, which was already very good in cross-government coordination, like within the government coordination between different ministries and so on. what I'm going to say is, in the process of doing the work we've been doing on subsidies, what I found is how diverse the skills, the set of skills you need is. Whenever you look at subsidies, you end up looking into so many different policy areas and so many different topics that you really need to keep an open mind and be ready to talk energy policy, competition policy, innovation policy, tax policy, of course, and finance, and all these things together. And that can be really hard. It's really a kind of Swiss Army knife job. And I think that mirrors very well the discussion about how governments themselves are having trouble to integrate and coordinate their positions on this.
So on that note, I'm gonna ask you all in a kind of a last question that you can all, and you can take as long as you like to answer it. So I'm going to put you in an elevator with a senior policymaker from the region who wants your insights into what they should be thinking about in industrial policy. So they're looking at the green transformation, they're looking at the digital transformation, and they're thinking, okay, where should I be putting my public policy effort? Where should I be making my investments? What's the advice that you would give them? And I'll put you on the sort of, maybe I'll put you in a skyscraper, I'll put you on the 25th floor. And so, you know, what's the advice that you would give? And maybe I'll start with you, Carla.
So I think I would start off by saying none of these policies, they're so complex, they're so interconnected, there's so many spillovers. You need economists, lawyers, arbitrators, you need the lot. What you need to start all of this off with is to make sure you have a really good civil service. You can't do any of this. You won't be able to implement, you won't be able to interpret, you won't be able to enforce unless you've got your cadre of really top people who really want to do the job well, because they're paid really well, they're really respected, and it's a great job, and it means that you're changing society. I think that took 5 floors.
I think actually it's interesting because one of the things that competition colleagues often point to, and they were talking to governments in the wake of COVID in particular, a senior government official was saying to me, actually now I find that suddenly we own an airport and we own some factories and they listed a bunch of businesses, and they're saying this is actually a bit of a challenge because we don't really know an awful lot about managing all these assets in which we now have a stake. So that process of how do we actually, this was in a crisis situation, but I think it goes to the point of when you're intervening, do you have the right tools? And your first tool, I guess, is people. I'm going to ask you a follow-up. I'm going to come back to you on it.
Actually, I do have one follow-up for you there, because I'm in the UK and Brexit, and that understanding of what is going on became really, really palpable after. I mean, we had civil servants who didn't know what a customs union was. So how on earth can you implement something as complex as Brexit when you have no idea what a customs union is?
I think it's very, I have a lot of sympathy for your colleagues who had I think, went from 50 people working on trade policy to 300 people working on trade policy in the space of a year. So I'm going to turn to Jean and then to Guy, and then a lightning round for the last question, which is going to be what not to do. But first, what's your positive advice? So Jean, you're in the elevator.
Well, my elevator advice wasn't what not to do, actually.
Okay.
I would say
this is trade policy people for you. We're
just exactly. Just forbid things. We don't. No, I would just say don't fall for the lure of the subsidy race. Don't join the race. Don't do that. Resist the urge to join others and do what others do. Instead, focus on what your country really needs and truly needs. So don't invest in a semiconductor fab because that's what everyone does. Do it because it really makes sense for your industry downstream, for your country, and at a reasonable cost. Just don't try to outbid others because it's not going to work.
Oh, and I think, yeah, this comes back a little bit to where we began with you in terms of talking about targeting. Over to you.
Thanks. So I would say that, of course, it's a key moment to implement better industrial policies, and a lot has been learned from the past, so we should avoid repeating these mistakes. We'll keep the description of these mistakes for your next question. But I think we need, among others, two important things. One that I already mentioned several times, so I will be very brief. It's comparable data across country for benchmarking and collaboration purposes. And second, policy evaluation. I mentioned that, but I will come back on this because I think that at the time being, governments need to put a stronger emphasis on evaluation and the regular reassessment of industrial policies. And I think it's linked to what Jean mentioned. It's not only doing like the others, it's doing the right subsidies and the most efficient subsidies. So the evidence on this is mixed so far, and evaluations have been difficult, but I think that digital technologies and new developments in artificial intelligence or machine learning have the potential to improve the effectiveness of evaluation, which will become cheaper and more timely. So that's something that governments should invest in.
Thank you. And actually, that's something absolutely that we're also seeing across the agriculture sphere, that you can make policy very differently with digital tools. Okay, Kamala, what not to do?
Don't do anything Don't do anything without an impact assessment report.
I should ask you for something positive now, Jean, to finish with.
I would just echo Guy on data. Just make it easier, make data available. Don't be so secretive about the subsidies you provide. There's nothing commercially sensitive actually in public money, taxpayers' money going to companies. Hiding all that under the guise of, but it's commercially sensitive, is I don't think a right argument when the money comes from taxpayers.
Guy, get the last word on what not to do.
Yeah, what not to do. So I mentioned the mistakes of the past. So I think there are two of them that I would like to cite now. The first is capture by vested interests. In the past, it happened, and it was related also to the large skill set required for civil servants dealing with industrial policy. So I completely echo what Kamala said. This is a very important point. And second, maybe what economists call general equilibrium effects is sometimes overlooked. In a nutshell, it means that if you want to support a given sector in your economy, it will have adverse effects on the other sectors. And you need to take that into account when selecting which sectors to select. It's not only true at the international level, it's also true at the national level, these negatives.
Thank you. Look, I think that that's a good note for us to wrap up on, because I think it comes back to a point that was made earlier, which is in a complex world and in the world of global value chains as well, the impacts of subsidies, the impacts of industrial policy may be unpredictable. The benefits may fall not where you think, and so may the costs. I think you've all highlighted the level of expertise, just the sheer range of issues that you need to be across, that you need to take into account in making policy across this area. And the fundamental message, I think, if I can draw all of you together on this, is that this is quite a hard thing to get right, to target the market failure, to understand where your interests are, not to follow the herd, to really look at something that makes sense. Design matters. And given the level of complexity, two things are going to matter. First is good data, comparable data that allows you to have that analysis, but perhaps also the policy transparency and the openness of the debate, because that allows you to bring in many different voices who can give you different perspectives and who can provide that accountability to ensure that we actually get what we're aiming for, we get the additionality, and we don't end up with very high opportunity costs on scarce public resources. So with that, can I thank you very much? Thank you, Kamala. Thank you, Guy. Thank you, Jean. And for a very interesting discussion across this wide and difficult topic. And I'll hand back now to Jose Antonio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia, and thank you to all the panelists of this second panel. I guess, well, we can see now the full picture of the first panel and the second panel, and both were really very rich in content. We went from the agriculture sector to the industry, analyzing the effects of subsidies, and all this, I guess, is very informative for the region as it aims to open its economy in a new context, and this will certainly be of quite useful for our policymakers as we head to this ministerial summit that we will have with different trade, economy, and finance ministers in June in Brazil. So thank you very much to all panelists. With all this, I just want to make a short reminder about the next webinar that we'll have on May 13. It will be again on trade, but now a bit more focused on the technification and services related to food systems, including digitalization, AI, biotech, precision agriculture, etc. And the second part will be also about the importance of services in the industrial sector and the impact on competitiveness. So stay tuned. I just put in the chat the link to the website of the Ministerial Summit that it's already live. We don't have yet all the information there, but you will see in the screen. I hope you are seeing the screen. Sorry, the website and a QR code where you can actually go to that website. You can actually see the recording of this webinar there, and also the registration for the next webinar. And we will be putting additional information on the ministerial that is coming in June 23 and 24. With that short commercial, and thanking all the different panelists and moderators, let me give the floor to Ambassador Carlos Marcio Cosende, who is the ambassador here of at the OECD from Brazil and other international organizations based in Paris. And he has been also the co-chair of the LAC regional program over these 3 years, and one of the promoters of this webinar in particular. So, Ambassador, you have the floor and the last word in this webinar.
Muito obrigado. Eu vou aproveitar a oportunidade para que haja alguém falando em português nesse seminário. Como o José Antônio nos explicou, esse webinar faz parte de um conjunto de eventos preparatórios da Ministerial de Produtividade, e a ideia é discutir, nesse contexto, como a região consegue se integrar no mundo numa situação em que, como vimos nas duas apresentações, há ainda um nível elevado de subsídios, de políticas que dificultam, às vezes, a inserção da região no cenário internacional. Nesse último painel, nós vimos, por exemplo, as recomendações de que, no contexto de uma política industrial, qualquer tipo de subsídio procure ser eficiente, eficaz, bem dirigido para objetivos bem definidos. Tudo isso é bastante importante, mas quando você não tem os recursos necessários, os recursos financeiros necessários, nada disso vai adiantar. E muitos países da região enfrentam essa dificuldade quando procuram colocar uma política de inserção internacional de pé. Eles têm que enfrentar na competição internacional, por vezes, outras economias que possuem esses programas de maneira bastante efetiva. Nós já enfrentamos essa dificuldade na área agrícola há alguns anos, é uma questão que nós temos bastante bem identificada, com a ajuda dos levantamentos que a OCDE faz regularmente, das discussões na OMC. nós temos já bastante claro o panorama na área de agricultura e como os subsídios tantas vezes distorcem os mercados internacionais e dificultam a inserção internacional da região. Nós temos visto com certa preocupação o crescimento dessas atividades também na área industrial, uma tendência a uma visão um pouco mais intervencionista na área industrial, e, como vimos aqui, as políticas tendem a ser implementadas de maneira bastante complexa e relativamente pouco transparentes. Nessa área industrial, ainda mais do que em agricultura, na medida em que os subsídios, pelas regras multilaterais, são menos permitidos na área industrial, tende a haver uma menor transparência quando se pergunta, como o Jean mencionou, quando se procura obter informações a esse respeito. A cooperação internacional nessa área, eu acho que ainda precisa avançar bastante. Mesmo na OCDE, nós vemos que, em alguns setores, não há sequer abertura para que a discussão aconteça, né? Nós, por exemplo, o Brasil tem interesse em discutir a questão dos subsídios na fase de desenvolvimento de aeronaves, por exemplo, e é um setor que é considerado muito sensível. Alguns países da OCDE evitam essa discussão. Então, eu acho que a OCDE é um espaço importante para que essa discussão avance e esperamos que haja abertura dos seus membros para que se discutam os subsídios sobre todos os setores, e não apenas aqueles setores que interessam a um ou outro país. Gostaria de agradecer a toda a equipe da OCDE que ajudou a organizar esse seminário, Marion, Júlia, Liane, o pessoal do GRS, José Antônio, Fábio e os outros colegas, e também aos painelistas que participaram, e, finalmente, aos tradutores, que espero estejam permitindo que entendam o que eu estou falando. Muito obrigado e até o próximo seminário no dia 13 de maio.
Thank you very much. And with this, we close the webinar.